Imagine, if you will, a kingdom built not on land, but on a powder. A realm whose borders were invisible, drawn across oceans and continents, enforced not by laws, but by the absolute, terrifying threat of violence. At the helm of this shadow empire stood a man who was less a person and more a force of nature, a spectral figure known to the world only by a title that inspired both reverence and pure dread. El Señor, the boss. This is the story of that man, Diego León Montoya Sánchez. But it is not a story that glorifies the darkness he represented. Instead, we will embark on a long, detailed, and unflinching journey to dissect the very anatomy of his power, to trace the arc of his monstrous rise and his inevitable, crumbling fall. This narrative, woven from the threads of declassified intelligence reports, courtroom testimonies, and the courageous work of journalists, is presented to you with a single, solemn purpose: to ensure that the true story, the correct information, reaches you not as a sensationalized myth, but as a historical record of one of the most formidable criminal enterprises the modern world has ever seen. So, prepare yourself for a tale that is as complex as it is brutal, a saga that stretches from the sleepy, sun-drenched towns of the Colombian countryside to the gleaming, money-soaked corridors of international power. We begin our story not with a bang, but in the quiet, almost pastoral calm of Palmira, in the Val del Cauca department, a place of sugarcane fields and modest aspirations, where in 1958, a boy was born into a world that had no idea of the monster it was about to create. The Colombia of Diego Montoya's youth was a nation simmering with underlying tensions, a country where the historical conflict between the liberal and conservative parties, known as La Violencia, had left a deep and lasting scar on the national psyche, normalizing bloodshed and creating a generation for whom violence was a tangible, ever-present solution to problems. It was in this atmosphere that young Diego learned his first lessons about power, that it was often taken, not given, and that loyalty was a currency more valuable than any peso. His family was not wealthy, but they were entrenched in the region's social fabric, and it was through these early connections that Diego first glimpsed the pathways that existed outside the rigid confines of lawful society. He was not a distinguished student, not a boy marked for academic or artistic greatness. His talents lay in a different, more primal arena, the arena of street smarts, of understanding human weakness, of recognizing opportunity where others saw only risk. He learned to navigate the bustling markets and the shadowy back alleys of his hometown with an easy confidence, building a network of contacts that would later form the bedrock of his empire. This was the late 1960s and early 1970s, a time when a new gold rush was beginning to sweep through Colombia. But this gold was not mined from the earth. It was refined in jungle laboratories from a humble-looking plant, the coca leaf. The first whispers of the cocaine trade were beginning to circulate, a low hum of opportunity that promised wealth beyond the wildest dreams of any sugarcane farmer, while the world was distracted by revolutions and rock and roll. A quiet, seismic shift was occurring in the northern corners of South America, and men like Pablo Escobar of the Medellin cartel were already learning how to weaponize this new commodity. Diego Montoya watched, and he learned. He saw the flashy cars and the sprawling haciendas that began to appear, owned by men who had been nobodies just years before. He understood that the old rules were breaking down, that a new aristocracy was being born, an aristocracy of outlaws, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was destined to be a king among them. He started small, as all legends do, not with kilos, but with grams, not with private jets, but with dilapidated trucks and small, time smuggling operations along the intricate river systems of Colombia. He was a foot soldier, a sicario in training, learning the brutal mechanics of the trade firsthand. He was present for the collections, for the negotiations that turned sour, for the enforcement of contracts that could only be written in blood. It was during this formative period that he forged the most important alliance of his life, a partnership with his cousin, Juan Carlos Ram Reza Badilla, a man who would later become known as Chapeta or Lollipop. Together, they were a perfect, symbiotic pair of predators. Montoya, the stoic, calculating strategist with an innate understanding of logistics and fear, and Ramhi Reza Badilla, the ruthless enforcer who relished the visceral terror his actions could inspire. They were young, hungry, and utterly without mercy, rising through the ranks of the local criminal milieu with a terrifying efficiency. The fall of the great cartels of Medellin and Cali in the 1990s, which might have seemed like a disaster to lesser men, was for Montoya and his cohort the opportunity of a lifetime. It was a power vacuum on a continental scale, and they were perfectly positioned to fill it. The scattered remnants of those older empires, the pilots, the chemists, the corrupt officials, and the hitmen, all needed new patrons, and the newly formed Norte del Valle Cartel, with Montoya as one of its chief architects, was ready to welcome them with open arms and full coffers. This was the moment the boy from Palmira truly died, and the legend of the boss was born, a phantom now ready to step into the light and cast a very long, very dark shadow over the entire world. With the chessboard of the Colombian underworld swept clear of its reigning kings, Diego Montoya and his Norte del Valle cartel did not merely step onto the stage. They seized it with a calculated, brutal force that announced a new era of narcoterrorism. The mid-1990s became a period of unprecedented expansion and consolidation, a time when Montoya's genius for logistics and his cousin's propensity for savage enforcement fused into a perfectly tuned criminal machine. The cartel's business model was a masterpiece of evil efficiency, a vertically integrated corporation dealing in death. They established control over every single link in the cocaine supply chain. From the remote coca fields in the Peruvian and Colombian highlands, where indigenous farmers, trapped in a cycle of poverty, harvested the leaves, to the sophisticated jungle laboratories that transformed the raw paste into pristine, high-purity cocaine hydrochloride. Montoya understood that control was everything, and his influence reached into the very ports and airports of Colombia, where his corrupt network of customs officials, police officers, and military personnel ensured that his product, his white gold, flowed out of the country as smoothly as water from a tap. The transportation methods themselves were a testament to his innovative ruthlessness. While the world's law enforcement agencies were fixated on monitoring boats and planes, the Norte del Valle Cartel pioneered the use of semi-submersible vessels, crude but effective submarines built in clandestine shipyards deep within the mangrove swamps, capable of carrying multi-ton loads of cocaine low in the water, invisible to radar on their slow, relentless journey towards the insatiable markets of North America and Europe. These narco-submarines were just one example of Montoya's ability to adapt and evolve, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. But the product was only one half of the equation. The other was the money, the staggering river of cash that flowed back into Colombia, a flood of US dollars that threatened to destabilize the entire national economy. Montoya established a vast and intricate money laundering apparatus, a complex web of front companies, shell corporations, and complicit bankers that stretched from the bustling streets of Bogota to the financial centers of Miami and New York. His empire purchased everything: legitimate businesses like car dealerships, pharmacies, and vast cattle ranches, professional football teams to gain social prestige and a veneer of respectability, and most importantly, it purchased people. The cartel's corruption was not merely transactional, it was systemic, reaching into the highest echelons of the Colombian political and judicial systems. Politicians on their payroll would pass favorable legislation or turn a blind eye to cartel activities. Judges were offered plata o plomo, silver or lead. Those who accepted the silver found themselves wealthy beyond their dreams. Those who refused the silver were inevitably delivered the lead, a bullet from one of the cartel's countless hired assassins. This is where the legend of Montoya's body count truly begins to form, a number that would eventually be estimated to be in the thousands. The violence was not random or chaotic. It was a precise, surgical tool of corporate management. Rival drug traffickers who dared to encroach on Norte del Valle territory were systematically hunted down and eliminated, their bodies often subjected to grotesque mutilations as a warning to others. Informants, or those even suspected of being informants, were tortured with unimaginable cruelty before being executed. Their deaths serving as a public service announcement about the cost of betrayal. The cartel maintained a dedicated army of sicarios, young men from the impoverished favelas who were offered more money in a single month than their fathers could earn in a lifetime, their humanity stripped away and replaced with a fanatical loyalty to the boss. One of the most feared of these enforcer units was a group known as Los Rastrojos, a paramilitary-style organization that acted as the cartel's military wing, controlling key trafficking routes and terrorizing entire regions into submission. Under Montoya's command, the Norte del Valle Cartel was not just a drug trafficking organization. It was a parallel state with its own laws, its own economy, and its own brutal form of justice. At the zenith of his power, it was estimated that the cartel was responsible for shipping up to 70% of the cocaine entering the United States, a staggering figure that represented not just addiction and crime on American streets, but a river of blood flowing back to its source in Colombia. Montoya himself lived a life of grotesque opulence and paranoid isolation, a sultan in a gilded cage. He owned a vast collection of luxury properties, each one a fortress equipped with state-of-the-art security, escape tunnels, and armies of bodyguards. He celebrated his daughter's birthday with a party that cost over $1 million, flying in popular musicians from across Latin America to perform for his guests, a stark, obscene display of wealth generated from misery and death. Yet for all his power, he was a ghost, a specter whose photograph was so rare that the authorities often relied on decades-old images. He trusted no one, moved constantly, and communicated through a labyrinth of encrypted devices and couriers. He was the invisible emperor, ruling his kingdom of cocaine from the shadows, believing himself to be utterly untouchable, a belief that would prove to be the first and most fatal of his many miscalculations. The turning point, the moment the invisible emperor began to cast a visible, targetable shadow, was not born from a single failed shipment or a betrayed associate, but from the relentless, mounting pressure of a world that had finally decided enough was enough. For years, the Colombian government, bolstered by billions of dollars in American aid through a program known as Plan Colombia, had been waging a war of attrition against the cartels. But the Norte del Valle Cartel, under Montoya's meticulous command, had proven to be a more elusive and sophisticated adversary than its predecessors. However, the walls began to close in with the dawn of the new millennium, a convergence of factors that Montoya's vast wealth and ruthlessness could not simply buy off or shoot down. The first and most critical crack in his armor was internal, a schism born from the very greed and paranoia that fueled his empire. The partnership with his cousin, Juan Carlos Ram Reza Badia Chapata, which had once been the engine of their success, began to fracture under the immense weight of money and power. Disagreements over strategy, over the division of profits amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars, and perhaps a simple, primal struggle for ultimate supremacy soared their alliance into a bitter and bloody feud. What was once a criminal brotherhood devolved into a civil war within the cartel, a conflict fought with the same ferocity they had once reserved for their external enemies. The streets of Cali and the backroads of Val del Cauca became battlegrounds as factions loyal to Montoya and factions loyal to Raman. Reza Badia turned on each other, a self-inflicted wound that left hundreds dead and, more importantly, created a flood of disgruntled, knowledgeable insiders who now had a motive to talk. This internal carnage provided the perfect opening for the authorities, who were quick to exploit the division, offering protective deals and new identities to those who would break the sacred code of Omert and testify against their former masters. Simultaneously, the international noose was tightening. The United States Department of Justice, through the Drug Enforcement Administration, had placed Montoya at the very top of its most wanted list, offering a $5 million reward for information, leading to his capture. A sum that turned every single person in Colombia into a potential bounty hunter. The U.S. government initiated an aggressive campaign of financial warfare, freezing assets, seizing properties, and indicting the bankers and lawyers who formed the circulatory system of Montoya's financial empire, slowly strangling the flow of capital that was his lifeblood. Furthermore, a new, relentless enemy emerged in the form of a specialized, elite Colombian police unit, the Search Block, modeled after the group that had eventually hunted down Pablo Escobar, but now armed with better intelligence, more sophisticated technology, and the hard-won lessons of the past. This unit operated with a singular, obsessive focus. Find Diego Montoya, a Chez. They raided his properties, intercepted his communications, and methodically dismantled his support network, arresting cooks, drivers, and money launderers, each small fish leading them closer to the shark. Montoya's world, once so vast and impenetrable, began to shrink dramatically. His movements became more restricted, his hiding places fewer and less secure. The man who once commanded an army was now reduced to a fugitive, constantly on the move, trusting only a shrinking circle of bodyguards, his paranoia becoming a self-made prison. The legend of the boss was being systematically deconstructed, not by a single heroic act, but by the slow, grinding, bureaucratic machinery of justice, fueled by the invaluable torrent of information flowing from the cartel's own internal war. The pressure was immense and unrelenting, a storm of legal, financial, and military force that left no stone unturned, no associate unpressured, no bank account unscrutinized. It was a testament to Montoya's resilience and resources that he managed to evade capture for as long as he did, but the writing was on the wall. The golden age of the Norte del Valle Cartel was over, and the age of reckoning was at hand. The empire was crumbling from within and without, and its emperor, once believed to be untouchable, was now a cornered animal, running out of places to hide, his every move tracked by the increasingly sophisticated electronic surveillance and the ever-growing number of eyes motivated by revenge, justice, or the life-changing lure of a $5 million prize. The hunter had become the hunted, and the final chapter of his reign in the shadows was being written not by him, but by the countless forces he had unleashed upon the world. The final act of Diego Montoya's life as a free man was a desperate, claustrophobic ballad played out not in the sprawling haciendas of his prime, but in a series of safe houses that grew progressively more squalid and confined, a perfect physical manifestation of his disintegrating power. The once unimaginably wealthy kingpin, accustomed to commanding his empire from a distance, was now reduced to a fugitive's existence. His world shrunk to a few rooms, his only company a handful of increasingly nervous bodyguards, and the ever-present, gnawing fear of betrayal. The man who had once flown private jets now moved under the cover of darkness in dilapidated cars, his face now prominently featured on wanted posters across the nation, a liability he could no longer afford. The internal war with his cousin, Chipita, had escalated into a paroxysm of violence that was consuming the cartel from the inside out, with each side hunting the other's top lieutenants, assassinating family members, and leaving a trail of mutilated bodies as gruesome calling cards. This internecine conflict was a gift to the authorities, a self-inflicted hemorrhage of operational security that provided a constant stream of intelligence, turning the hunt for Montoya from a difficult investigation into a closing net. The elite search bloc, armed with this intelligence, was getting agonizingly close. They would raid a farm only days after Montoya had slipped away. They would intercept a courier carrying messages to his inner circle. They would freeze a bank account just hours before he needed to access it. The psychological toll on Montoya was immense. The paranoia that had always been a professional tool for survival was now his personal prison warden, distorting his judgment and turning every whisper, every glance from his remaining allies into a potential death sentence. He trusted no one, and in doing so, he isolated the one thing that had kept him safe for so long, his network of loyalists. The $5 million bounty on his head, a sum that represented a lifetime of luxury for any ordinary Colombian, hung over his head like a sword of Damocles, making every beggar on the street, every shopkeeper, every farmer in the field a potential informant. The United States government, relentless in its pursuit, had successfully extradited several of his top associates who, facing the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in a brutal American supermax prison, began to cooperate, providing detailed maps of the cartel's structure, its shipping routes, and, most critically, the habits and possible hiding places of the boss himself. The pressure was multidimensional, a relentless assault on his finances, his allies, his logistics, and his psyche. He could no longer effectively lead his empire. He could only run, a reactionary existence focused solely on survival. His physical health began to deteriorate from the constant stress, and the Spartan conditions, a far cry from the opulent lifestyle he had so famously enjoyed. The myth of the invincible, Sayor, was crumbling in real time, replaced by the reality of a desperate, middle-aged man on the run, his power evaporating with each passing day. The Colombian government, sensing a historic victory was within its grasp, redoubled its efforts, deploying thousands of soldiers and police officers to the region, setting up checkpoints on every major and minor road, and conducting sweeping door-to-door searches in towns and villages suspected of harboring him. The net was not just closing, it was suffocating. The entire nation seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the most wanted man in Colombia would finally be brought to ground. The final days were a blur of narrow escapes and mounting desperation, a chaotic scramble from one precarious hiding place to another, each one less secure than the last. The man who had once controlled a global enterprise was now a prisoner of his own notoriety. His fate no longer in his own hands, but in the hands of the few men who still guarded him, and the relentless, methodical hunters who were tracing his every step, piecing together his movements from 1,000 scattered clues, moving in for the final, decisive strike that would end a decade long reign of terror and bring a ghost into the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. The end came not with a dramatic, cinematic gun battle, but with a quiet, almost mundane rustle in the undergrowth, a final, pathetic whimper for a man whose life had been defined by the roar of violence and the thunder of his own power. On the morning of September 10, 2007, after a tip off from a paid informant whose loyalty had been purchased by the colossal bounty, a joint force of the Colombian National Police's search block and army soldiers surrounded a small, nondescript farmhouse nestled in the dense, humid countryside of the department of Val del Cauca, not far from his hometown of Palmira, a cruel irony that brought his life full circle. The property, known as La Casuna, was a far cry from the luxurious fortresses of his past. It was a simple, two-story structure, modest and unassuming, a perfect reflection of how low the mighty had fallen. Inside, Diego Montoya Sánchez, the legendary boss, was hiding not in a panic room or an underground bunker, but in a small, cramped space between the ceiling of the ground floor and the floor of the second story, a hot, dark crawl space filled with dust and insulation, a final, fitting metaphor for his reduced state. As the security forces closed in, there was no last stand, no grand final speech, no desperate attempt to shoot his way to freedom. The man who had ordered thousands of murders was found unarmed, cowering in his pathetic hidey hole, drenched in sweat and resigned to his fate. He offered no resistance as he was dragged out into the daylight, his clothes soiled, his face a mask of exhaustion and defeat. The photograph that was instantly transmitted across the globe was startling in its banality. It showed a balding, paunchy middle-aged man in a cheap, striped polo shirt, his hands cuffed behind his back, being firmly escorted by triumphant, camouflage-clad soldiers. This was not the face of a demon or a mythical beast. It was the face of a tired, defeated human being. A stark and powerful demystification of the monster the world had feared for so long. The capture was hailed as one of the most significant victories in the decades-long Colombian drug war, a personal triumph for President Álvaro Uribe and a testament to the relentless pressure applied by both Colombian and American authorities. For the people of Colombia, it was a moment of collective catharsis, a signal that perhaps no criminal, no matter how powerful or wealthy, was truly beyond the reach of the law. But the capture was only the beginning of the end. The moment the gavel of justice was lifted, poised to fall, Montoya was immediately transferred to a high-security military base, where he was processed and formally charged with a staggering list of crimes that included drug trafficking, money laundering, and ordering more than 3,000 murders. The legal proceedings that followed were a complex and protracted affair, as Montoya, now facing the full weight of the state he had so flagrantly defied, employed every possible tactic to delay and mitigate his fate. He was initially tried in Colombia, where he faced the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence. But the true sword hanging over his head was the threat of extradition to the United States, a prospect he and his lawyers fought with desperate intensity. The American justice system promised a level of punishment from which there was no return. A life sentence in the most secure prisons imaginable, cut off from his family, his wealth, and any lingering influence he might have hoped to wield from behind bars. For years, he languished in Colombian prisons, a high-profile inmate whose every movement was monitored, as his legal team battled in the courts. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. A mountain of testimony from former associates, financial records, and intercepted communications that painted an inescapable picture of his guilt. In December 2008, just over a year after his capture, the final blow fell. The Colombian government approved his extradition to the United States, where he would face federal charges in a Florida courtroom. This was the moment he had dreaded most. The final acknowledgement that his power had evaporated completely, that he was now just another commodity to be shipped north to answer for his crimes. The man who had once moved multi-ton shipments of cocaine with impunity was now himself a packaged cargo, securely transported on a U.S. government plane, leaving his homeland behind forever, to face judgment in a foreign land whose streets he had flooded with his product and whose laws he had spent a lifetime violating. The emperor's journey into his final, permanent exile had begun. The courtroom in the United States, District Court for the Southern District of Florida, was a world away from the jungles and riverways of Val del Cauca, a sterile, air-conditioned arena where the final, formal dismantling of the myth of the boss would take place. Here, the language was not of violence and intimidation, but of legal precedent and federal statutes. The evidence presented against Diego Montoya was not merely compelling, it was catastrophic, a tidal wave of documentation and testimony that left no room for doubt or defense. The prosecution, representing the full might of the American judicial system, laid out its case with methodical precision, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise of almost unimaginable scope and brutality. They presented ledgers detailing the shipment of over 500 tons of cocaine into the United States, a quantity so vast it defied comprehension, representing billions of dollars in street-level sales and countless lives touched by addiction and violence. They called upon a procession of former cartel members, including mid-level managers, pilots, and money launderers, who had all cut deals to reduce their own sentences. Their testimonies weaving a complex but coherent narrative of Montoya's central, commanding role. These were not just foot soldiers. They were his trusted lieutenants, men who had sat in meetings with him, who had taken his orders directly, and who could now, under oath, detail his specific instructions for murders, his approval for specific smuggling routes, and his intimate involvement in the financial machinations that kept the empire afloat. The most damaging testimony, however, likely came from his own cousin and former partner, Juan Carlos Ramrez Abadia Chipeta, who had himself been captured in Brazil in 2007 and extradited to the United States. Facing multiple life sentences, Ramrez Abadia chose to cooperate, and his insider account provided the prosecution with an unparalleled bird's eye view of the cartel's inner workings, its boardroom style meetings where life and death decisions were made with cold, corporate efficiency. He detailed their partnership, their rise to power, their eventual bitter feud, and the specific acts of violence Montoya had ordered. This was not the testimony of a distant associate. This was the testimony of his other half, the man who had helped him build the empire, and it carried an undeniable weight of truth. Alongside the human witnesses, the prosecution presented a silent, yet equally damning, chorus of physical evidence, satellite photographs of jungle laboratories, financial records tracing the labyrinthine flow of money through shell companies, and intercepted communications that captured the cartel's operational chatter. Faced with this insurmountable wall of evidence, Montoya's legal team had few options. The bravado and defiance that had characterized his life on the run had no place in this sober setting. After a period of negotiation on September 24, 2008, Diego León Montoya Sánchez stood before the American judge and pleaded guilty to charges of engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise and conspiracy to launder monetary instruments. His plea was not an act of contrition, but one of cold, hard pragmatism, an acknowledgement that the battle was irrevocably lost. By pleading guilty, he avoided a trial that would have undoubtedly ended in a conviction and potentially secured a minor technical reduction in his sentence, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. The sentencing hearing was the final act of the judicial drama, where the full weight of his life's work was formally laid upon his shoulders. The prosecution vividly described the trail of carnage he had left in his wake, the thousands of murders, the corrupted institutions, the communities torn apart by addiction and fear. They spoke of him not as a romanticized outlaw, but as a mass murderer on an industrial scale, a parasite who had grown fat on the suffering of others. When the moment came for the judge to deliver the sentence, there was no hesitation, no ambiguity. Diego Montoya Sánchez was sentenced to 45 years in a federal prison, a term that, given his age, was the functional equivalent of a life sentence. The number 45 echoed in the quiet room, a numerical tombstone sealing his fate. The man who had commanded private armies, who had corrupted nations, who had lived a life of almost mythical power and opulence, was now reduced to a case number, a prisoner destined to spend his remaining decades in a small, concrete cell. His world shrunk to the dimensions defined by the United States Bureau of Prisons. The gavel fell, and with it, the story of the boss, the legendary drug lord, was officially over. All that remained was the long, slow, anonymous twilight of imprisonment, a perpetual, monotonous punishment where the only thing left to command was the memories of his own monstrous deeds, replaying in an endless loop in the silence of his cell. The slamming of the prison gates behind Diego Montoya Sánchez was not merely the end of a man, but the end of an era, and it is here that we must pause to consider the true, sprawling legacy of his life. A legacy measured not in the wealth he accumulated, but in the profound and lasting damage he inflicted upon the very fabric of nations. The 45-year sentence, while just, could never truly serve as restitution for the ocean of suffering his actions had caused. a suffering that rippled outwards from his jungle laboratories to touch every corner of the Western Hemisphere. In the United States, his legacy was written in the countless lives lost to addiction, the families shattered by overdose, the children born into dependency, and the communities, from the inner cities to the quiet suburbs, that were ravaged by the street level violence fueled by the distribution of his product, the cocaine that he pumped into the country with such industrial efficiency was not a harmless recreational drug. It was a scourge that exacerbated crime, overwhelmed social services, and filled prisons, creating a public health crisis whose costs, both human and financial, are incalculable and whose effects are still being felt generations later. His actions directly contributed to the destabilization of entire American cities and fueled a brutal war between rival gangs fighting for control of the lucrative markets he had supplied. A war fought with guns, purchased by the very money he had earned from their misery. But the impact on his own homeland, Colombia, was even more visceral and catastrophic. The Norte del Valle Cartel, under his leadership, institutionalized a level of violence and corruption that seeped into the bone marrow of the nation. The estimated 3,000 murders he ordered are not just a statistic. They represent a generation of lost fathers, sons, brothers, and community leaders, each one a story cut short, a family plunged into grief, a community left traumatized. The cartel's practice of plata o plomo corrupted the very institutions designed to protect Colombian society, eroding public trust in the police, the judiciary, and the political class, creating a cynicism and a culture of impunity that the country has struggled for decades to overcome. The sheer financial power of the cartel distorted the Colombian economy, inflating real estate prices, creating a culture of grotesque and unearned wealth, and making the criminal path seem like the only viable option for ambitious young men in impoverished regions, thus perpetuating a vicious cycle of violence. Furthermore, the cartel's alliance with and funding of right-wing paramilitary groups, most notably the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC, poured gasoline on the already raging fire of Colombia's decades-long internal conflict, leading to massacres, forced displacements of entire villages, and some of the worst human rights atrocities in the nation's modern history. Montoya's empire was a key node in a complex web of conflict that pitted guerrillas, paramilitaries, and the state against each other, with the civilian population forever caught in the crossfire. The environmental damage alone was staggering, with hundreds of thousands of acres of rainforest destroyed for coca cultivation and toxic chemicals from jungle laboratories leaching into rivers and soil, poisoning water supplies and devastating local ecosystems. His legacy is also one of profound moral decay, a coarsening of the social fabric where life became cheap and violence the primary language of power. For every one of Montoya's lavish parties, there were 1,000 Colombian families mourning. For every one of his luxury ranches, there was a mass grave hidden in the countryside. The capture and imprisonment of Montoya, while a necessary and symbolic victory for justice, did not magically erase this legacy. The networks of corruption he helped embed are difficult to root out. The trauma of the violence is passed down through generations, and the demand for cocaine, which fueled his empire, persists, ensuring that new criminal organizations will always rise to take the place of the old. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez, therefore, is not a closed chapter in a history book. It is a living, painful memory for millions, a cautionary tale about the absolute corruption that absolute power brings, and a stark reminder that the true cost of the drug trade is not measured in dollars, but in human souls. In broken societies, and in a legacy of pain that stretches far beyond the lifetime of any single kingpin, no matter how powerful he once seemed to be. To truly understand the phenomenon of Diego Montoya, one must look beyond the man himself and into the dark ecosystem that allowed his species to flourish, an environment where the very structures of society, politics, economics, and international relations converge to create a perfect storm for his kind of criminal enterprise. The rise of the Norte del Valle Cartel was not an anomaly. It was the logical, almost inevitable outcome of a specific set of historical and geopolitical circumstances that provided the fertile ground in which such a monstrous organization could take root and thrive. The insatiable demand for narcotics in the United States and Europe was the primary engine, an economic black hole that generated astronomical profits, creating a financial incentive so powerful it could and did overwhelm the moral and legal frameworks of entire nations. This demand created a market force that was immune to traditional law enforcement, a fundamental economic principle that guaranteed a supply would always emerge to meet it, regardless of the human cost. On the supply side, Colombia offered a perfect storm of its own, a geography of rugged mountains, impenetrable jungles, and vast coastlines that made interdiction a logistical nightmare for any government, no matter how committed. This was compounded by a history of political violence and social inequality that had left large segments of the population marginalized and desperate, creating a ready pool of recruits for whom the cartel's offer of wealth and power was an irresistible alternative to a life of poverty and hopelessness. The historical context of the long-standing conflict between guerrilla groups like the FARC and the Colombian state created a landscape of lawlessness in vast regions of the country, areas where the government's authority was theoretical at best, allowing the cartels to operate with impunity and often forcing them to choose sides or create tactical alliances, further militarizing their operations and blurring the lines between political insurgency and pure criminal enterprise. The pivotal moment, however, was the fall of the Medellin and Cali cartels in the 1990s. The decapitation of these older, more centralized organizations did not end the drug trade, it democratized it. It shattered the cocaine industry into a constellation of smaller, more agile, and less predictable criminal bands. And the Norte del Valle Cartel, under Montoya's leadership, was the most successful and ruthless of these new entities. They learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, where Pablo Escobar had sought political power and public adulation. making himself a visible target. Montoya operated as a phantom, a corporate CEO of crime who understood that visibility was a liability. Where the Cali cartel had embedded itself too deeply and conspicuously in the political establishment, leading to its downfall, Montoya practiced a more distributed, less overt form of corruption that was harder to trace and dismantle. The international response, particularly the United States, Plan Colombia, while ultimately instrumental in his capture, was also a double-edged sword. The massive infusion of military aid and training certainly bolstered the Colombian state's capacity to fight the cartels. But it also had the effect of militarizing the conflict further, often leading to human rights abuses and inadvertently pushing the drug trade into more remote areas, forcing the cartels to innovate with new trafficking methods like the semi-submersibles. The global financial system, with its opaque networks of shell companies and offshore banking havens, willingly or unwillingly became an accomplice, providing the mechanisms to launder and legitimize billions of dollars in drug proceeds, integrating the cartel's wealth into the legitimate global economy and making it incredibly difficult to untangle. In this sense, Diego Montoya was as much a product of his environment as he was a creator of it. He was a symptom of a deeper, more intractable global crisis, the failure of prohibitionist drug policies to curb demand, the existence of profound economic disparities, and the weaknesses in international governance and financial regulation. He was a master at exploiting every single one of these systemic flaws, turning them to his advantage with a cold, strategic brilliance. His story, therefore, is not just the biography of a criminal, but a dark mirror held up to the world, reflecting the interconnected failures and complicities that allow such vast criminal empires to exist. To view him as a singular monster is to misunderstand the nature of the problem. He was the most successful weed in a garden that had been perfectly prepared for his growth. A garden that, despite the efforts of countless brave individuals, remains fertile to this day, waiting for the next seeds of destruction to fall. The system that created Diego Montoya Sánchez in many ways remains intact, a sobering thought that tempers any celebration of his downfall with the grim realization that the conditions for the next boss are already in place, nurtured by the same enduring global dynamics of demand, despair, and deregulation that have always fueled the endless, bloody cycle of the drug war. The world that Diego Montoya left behind as he began his eternal confinement was a world irrevocably scarred by his actions, yet also a world that had begun to adapt and fight back with a resilience that ultimately sealed his fate. The aftermath of his reign and the dismantling of the Norte del Valle Cartel did not bring a clean end to the drug trade, but it did represent a significant evolution in the nature of the conflict and the strategies employed to combat it. On the law enforcement front, the successful hunt for Montoya became a new blueprint for international cooperation, a case study in how to combine intelligence gathering, financial tracking, and military pressure to systematically dismantle a sophisticated transnational criminal organization. The lessons learned from his pursuit were immediately applied to other high-value targets, leading to a string of captures and extraditions that demonstrated a new level of efficacy and coordination between Colombian and American agencies. This model of shared intelligence, synchronized operations, and relentless pressure on financial networks has since become the global standard for confronting organized crime syndicates, from Mexican cartels to Asian trafficking rings. The legal tool of extradition, which Montoya feared so deeply, was proven to be a devastatingly effective weapon, breaking the perceived impunity that kingpins enjoyed within their home countries and exposing them to a justice system abroad that was immune to their traditional tools of corruption and intimidation. Within Colombia, his capture provided a massive boost to the morale of the security forces and the legitimacy of the state, proving to a weary populace that even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice. It marked a pivotal moment in the nation's long and painful journey to reclaim its sovereignty from the narco-traffickers, a process that continues to this day with a mixture of hard-won successes and persistent challenges. The space created by the destruction of the large, monolithic cartels like Norte del Valle was not left vacant for long. It was quickly filled by a new generation of criminal actors, but these were often smaller, more decentralized organizations known as Baquaraim or bandas criminales emergentes. These groups were less hierarchical and more networked, making them potentially more resilient and harder to decapitate with a single arrest. Many of these new groups were formed from the shattered remnants of Montoya's empire, the demobilized paramilitary factions, and the lingering guerrilla structures, creating hybrid criminal enterprises that diversified their portfolios beyond cocaine into illegal mining, extortion, and human trafficking. This fragmentation of the criminal landscape, while making it less likely for a single figure to ever again amass the concentrated power of a Pablo Escobar or a Diego Montoya, also made the violence more diffuse and in some ways more complex to combat. The social and cultural legacy of Montoya's era is also profound and deeply ambiguous. In some quarters of Colombian society, particularly in his home region, a warped and dangerous narrative of the narcoculture persists, a romanticization of the outlaws who defied the state and achieved immense wealth, a narrative often perpetuated in popular music, telenovelas, and local folklore that dangerously glosses over the brutal reality of murder and corruption. This cultural residue is a constant battle for a society trying to heal, a ghost of a traumatic past that threatens to glorify the very forces that cause so much pain. Yet, alongside this, there is a stronger, more powerful counter narrative of resilience and a collective rejection of that violent past. The bravery of the journalists who investigated the cartels at great personal risk, the judges who refused to be intimidated, the police officers and soldiers who fought on the front lines, and the ordinary citizens who refused to accept a culture of fear have become a central part of Colombia's modern identity. The country has undergone a remarkable transformation in the years since Montoya's peak, with major cities like Medellin and Cali once epicenters of cartel violence, reinventing themselves as hubs of innovation and tourism, though the underlying challenges of inequality and rural violence remain. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez, therefore, does not have a neat and tidy ending. His imprisonment is a closed door on one specific horror, but it opened a window onto a new, more complex phase in the endless war on drugs. It demonstrated that kingpins can be caught, but it also revealed the hydra-like nature of the illicit trade, where for every head cut off, two more may grow in its place unless the root causes, the demand, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, are addressed with the same vigor and resources as the symptomatic violence itself. His life stands as a dark monument to a particular time and place, but the shadow it casts is long, and we are all, in one way or another, still living in it. Grappling with the consequences of the world he helped create and searching for a way to finally step into the light. As we delve deeper into the anatomy of Montoya's empire, it becomes crucial to examine the human machinery that kept this vast criminal enterprise functioning. The countless individuals whose lives were ensnared in its gears, from the willing accomplices to the coerced victims, all forming a complex social ecosystem that sustained the power of its central figure. Beyond the infamous sicarios and the top-tier lieutenants, the cartel relied upon a small army of specialized professionals whose skills were perverted to serve its dark purposes. There were the chemists, often educated individuals with advanced knowledge of organic chemistry, who oversaw the intricate process of refining coca paste into its final, potent form, working in sweltering, makeshift jungle laboratories under armed guard, their scientific curiosity traded for a large salary and the constant threat of death. There were the pilots, a breed of incredibly skilled and fearless aviators who navigated small, overloaded aircraft on treacherous routes, flying low to avoid radar, making perilous nighttime landings on clandestine airstrips, their lives a constant gamble against both mechanical failure and interception, all for a payment that could set them up for life after just a few successful trips. There were the logisticians and accountants, the quiet, unassuming men and women who managed the mind-bogglingly complex flow of goods and money, coordinating shipments across continents, tracking inventory with corporate precision, and devising the intricate schemes to launder billions of dollars through front companies, real estate investments, and complicit financial institutions around the world. Then there were the corruptors, the smooth-talking intermediaries whose job was to identify and exploit weakness in the system, approaching politicians, police commanders, and judicial officials with offers of wealth too great to refuse or threats too terrifying to ignore, systematically weakening the institutions designed to uphold the law. And at the very bottom of this pyramid of complicity were the thousands of anonymous, often impoverished individuals who formed the base of the operation. The coca farmers in Peru and Colombia, trapped in an economic system that offered no other viable crop, growing the leaves that were the raw material of the empire, the lookouts or campaneros, who would stand watch along highways and rivers, using radios or cell phones to warn of police or military movements. The money mules, who would physically transport suitcases of cash across borders, and the countless men and women who worked in the cartel's legitimate businesses, often unaware of the true, bloody source of their paychecks. This vast network was held together not by loyalty alone, but by a sophisticated system of incentives and punishments that Montoya and his inner circle mastered. The financial rewards were astronomical, capable of lifting individuals and their entire families out of poverty in a single transaction, creating a powerful vested interest in the continuation of the enterprise. But this carrot was always paired with a monstrous stick. The penalty for failure, for dishonesty, or even for suspected disloyalty was not merely dismissal, it was torture and death, often carried out in a public and gruesome manner designed to serve as a warning to others. The cartel's enforcement wings, like Los Rastrojos, were not just hit squads. They were the human resources department of a corporation of death, tasked with maintaining discipline through sheer terror. This created an environment of pervasive fear, where no one, from the lowest farmer to the highest lieutenant, could ever feel truly safe, where a misplaced word, a failed shipment, or the whisper of arrival could lead to a death sentence for oneself and one's entire family. This is the true horror of Montoya's legacy on a human level, the countless lives he corrupted, the potential he destroyed, and the moral compromises he forced upon thousands. He turned scientists into drug manufacturers, pilots into smugglers, bankers into money launderers, and farmers into serfs of an illicit economy. He took the hopes, skills, and ambitions of an entire generation and channeled them into a single, destructive purpose, building his empire on a foundation of broken dreams and extinguished lives. For every one of Montoya's lavish parties, there were 100 families of those who served him living in quiet desperation, trapped in a golden cage of their own making, wealthy, but forever looking over their shoulders, knowing that the wealth that provided them comfort was drenched in the blood of the countless souls who had fallen to protect it. This human ecosystem was as fragile as it was vast, and its eventual collapse, triggered by the internal feud and external pressure, sent shockwaves through this entire network, leaving a trail of shattered lives, informants, and fugitives in its wake, a social disaster that is one of the most enduring and tragic consequences of the reign of Diego Montoya Sánchez. To comprehend the sheer scale of the Norte del Valle Cartel's operations, one must attempt to grasp the mind-numbing financial architecture that supported it. A shadow economy so vast and sophisticated that it rivaled the legitimate financial systems of small nations, and whose primary architect was Diego Montoya Sánchez. The revenue stream was a continuous, roaring river of cash, estimated to be in the billions of dollars annually, a torrent of U.S. currency that presented a problem almost as complex as the smuggling itself: how to launder it, to transform the physical, tainted bills from drug sales on American streets into clean, investable capital. The process began at the most granular level in the United States, with thousands of individuals known as Smurfs, who would make structured deposits of less than $10,000, the reporting threshold for banks, into countless accounts across the country, a labor-intensive but effective method to avoid immediate detection. From there, the money would be transferred through a dizzying array of shell companies and front businesses, often based in offshore havens like Panama, the Cayman Islands, or the Bahamas, jurisdictions chosen for their banking secrecy laws and lax regulatory oversight. These companies, with innocuous names holding no real assets or employees, existed only on paper. Their sole purpose to obfuscate the paper trail and create layers of plausible deniability between the drug money and its ultimate beneficiaries. Montoya's cartel invested heavily in legitimate businesses within Colombia, purchasing vast cattle ranches, lucrative chain pharmacies, popular car dealerships, and even interests in professional football teams, not only as a means to launder money, but also to gain social prestige and a veneer of respectability, a tactic known as blanqueo de capitales, or capital bleaching. The sheer volume of cash, however, was so immense that it physically had to be transported back to Colombia, often in shipping containers disguised as legitimate cargo or packed into the hidden compartments of commercial airliners. A logistical nightmare that required the corruption of customs officials on both ends of the journey. Once in Colombia, the cash was used to pay the enormous operational costs of the empire, the salaries of thousands of employees from hitmen to chemists, the bribes to officials at every level of government, the purchase of weapons, aircraft, and submarines, and the construction of luxurious estates and hideouts. The cartel's financial power was so great that it actively distorted the Colombian economy. At one point, the influx of US dollars was so massive that it artificially strengthened the Colombian peso, hurting legitimate exports and creating what economists termed the Dutch disease of the narcotics trade. The money also funded a lifestyle of almost mythical opulence for Montoya and his inner circle, a world of private Zeus, fleets of classic cars, gold-plated weapons, and parties where the champagne flowed like water and popular musicians were flown in for private concerts. Yet, this financial empire was also its most vulnerable point. Following the money was the key strategy that ultimately led to Montoya's downfall. The United States Department of the Treasury, through its Office of Foreign Assets Control, began designating the cartel and its key members as significant foreign narcotics traffickers, known as the Kingpin Act, which legally prohibited U.S. companies and citizens from doing any business with them and froze any of their assets within U.S. jurisdiction. This was a devastating blow, severing their access to the international financial system and making it exponentially harder to move and hide their wealth. American and Colombian authorities began to work in unison, tracing wire transfers, seizing properties, and indicting the bankers and lawyers who facilitated the money laundering, methodically strangling the financial lifeblood of the organization. Every seized asset, every frozen account, was a direct blow to Montoya's power, limiting his ability to pay his army, bribe officials, and maintain his operations. The financial siege was as critical as the military one, demonstrating that in the modern world, a criminal kingpin is only as powerful as his ability to access and spend his money. The billions of dollars that once flowed like water were slowly dammed up, drop by drop, by the relentless, patient work of financial investigators, until the river ran dry, leaving Montoya isolated, unable to fund his war, and vulnerable to the final physical capture that would end his reign. His financial empire, a masterpiece of illicit engineering, was systematically dismantled, proving that even the most formidable fortune, built on a foundation of crime, cannot ultimately protect a man from the collective will of nations determined to bring him to justice. The psychological portrait of Diego Montoya Sánchez is as complex and shadowy as the jungle paths he used for his operations, a study in contradictions that reveals the inner workings of a man who could orchestrate industrial scale slaughter while maintaining the facade of a devoted family man and a pillar of his local community. To those within his inner circle, he was not a raving lunatic, but a figure of calm, calculating authority, a man who spoke little, but whose words carried the weight of absolute command. This stoic demeanor was not a sign of a lack of emotion, but rather a carefully cultivated tool of leadership, projecting an image of unshakable control that inspired both loyalty and abject fear in his subordinates. He understood that unpredictability was a weapon, and his silence often proved more terrifying than any outburst of rage, leaving his men constantly guessing at his thoughts and intentions, ensuring their unwavering obedience. This same man, who could coldly authorize the massacre of an entire family suspected of disloyalty, was known to be deeply sentimental about his own family, particularly his daughter, for whose safety and comfort he would spare no expense, creating a bizarre dichotomy between the ruthless kingpin and the doting father. This capacity for compartmentalization is one of the defining features of the criminal psychopath. The ability to wall off sections of their humanity, allowing them to commit unspeakable acts without being crippled by guilt or remorse. For Montoya, the violence was never personal. It was purely business, a necessary cost of operations, a line item in the balance sheet of his empire. His worldview was likely shaped in the crucible of his youth, in a region where power was often seized by the strong, and where the institutions of the state were either absent or corrupt, teaching him from an early age that survival and success depended on one's own ruthlessness and resources. As his power grew, so did his paranoia, a necessary survival instinct that eventually curdled into a pervasive condition that dictated his every move. He trusted no one completely, not even his own cousin, and his life became a relentless routine of movement and concealment, a ghost drifting between a network of safe houses, each one a fortress, but also a prison of his own making. He could never truly relax, never lower his guard, for he knew that the bounty on his head made every stranger a potential threat and every ally a potential traitor. This constant state of hyper-vigilance must have been an exhausting way to exist, a psychological torment that was the hidden cost of his immense power. The immense wealth he accumulated was not just for luxury. It was a tool to feed this paranoia, funding ever more elaborate security measures. From escape tunnels and armored rooms to private armies of bodyguards who were themselves constantly vetted and often replaced. Yet, despite all his power and wealth, he was ultimately a slave to his own empire, trapped by the monstrous system he had created. The man who sought ultimate freedom through criminal enterprise found himself with less personal freedom than the most humble of his citizens, unable to walk down a street, enjoy a public meal, or form a genuine friendship without the specter of betrayal or capture looming over him. His final days on the run, cowering in a cramped crawl space, were the ultimate manifestation of this psychological imprisonment, the final, pathetic reduction of a man who had once dreamed of being an emperor. The capture itself, the moment he was dragged into the light, likely brought with it a strange, paradoxical sense of relief. The end of the relentless running, the closing of a chapter defined by fear. The 45-year sentence in an American prison, while a brutal punishment, also represents a perverse form of stability, a life where the choices have been taken away, the running has stopped, and the constant, gnawing fear of a violent death has been replaced by the monotonous certainty of a life behind bars. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez is, in its final analysis, a tragic one, not for the loss of his power, but for the utter annihilation of his humanity. A life spent building a kingdom of shadows only to become its most prominent prisoner, a cautionary tale written not in ink, but in the deep, lasting scars left on his own soul and on the soul of the nation he helped to tear apart. The technological evolution of the Norte del Valle Cartel under Montoya's leadership represents a dark parallel to the legitimate business world's embrace of innovation, a relentless arms race where cutting-edge advancements were not used to improve lives, but to perfect the machinery of smuggling and evasion. This was not the crude, brute force operation of earlier cartels. It was a technologically sophisticated corporation that constantly adapted to and often anticipated the countermeasures deployed against it. The most iconic symbol of this innovation was the semi-submersible vessel, or narco-submarine, a crude but brilliantly effective boat built in clandestine jungle shipyards. These vessels, constructed from fiberglass and wood, were designed to ride low in the water, with only a tiny cockpit and air vents visible, making them nearly invisible to radar and routine aerial surveillance. They were slow, uncomfortable, and perilous for their crews, but they could carry multi-ton loads of cocaine on journeys stretching from the Pacific coast of Colombia to the shores of Mexico or Central America, representing a quantum leap in the cartel's ability to move product. As authorities improved their detection methods for these semi-submersibles, the cartel's engineers responded by developing fully submersible submarines, true underwater vessels capable of traveling completely submerged. A technological marvel that demonstrated the cartel's vast resources and engineering prowess. Beyond the maritime realm, the cartel invested heavily in communications technology. They employed complex networks of encrypted satellite phones and used frequency, hopping radios to avoid interception, constantly changing their communication protocols to stay ahead of eavesdropping agencies. They established elaborate early warning systems along their key trafficking routes, using networks of lookouts equipped with cell phones and two-way radios to create a human radar system that could alert them to police or military movements, allowing shipments to be rerouted or hidden at a moment's notice. The cartel's logistical software was not a digital program, but a human one, built on a foundation of coded language, complex hand signals, and a cellular operational structure where individual units knew only what was necessary for their specific task, ensuring that the compromise of one cell would not lead to the collapse of the entire network. In the financial sphere, their technological adaptation was equally impressive. They utilized sophisticated software to manage their complex money laundering operations, tracking the flow of billions of dollars through a global maze of shell companies and front businesses. They employed experts in cybercrime to explore new methods of moving money digitally, staying abreast of emerging technologies like cryptocurrency, which offered new avenues for anonymous financial transactions. This embrace of technology extended to their weaponry, which evolved from small arms to include military-grade equipment, including rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and even, in some instances, attempts to acquire surface-to-air missiles to threaten law enforcement aircraft. The cartel's ability to corrupt extended to the technological domain as well, with evidence suggesting they bribed or coerced individuals within telecommunications companies to gain access to private data or to secure untraceable phone lines. This constant technological innovation was a direct response to the increasing sophistication of their adversaries. A high-stakes game of cat and mouse where the mouse was brilliantly clever and lavishly funded. The American and Colombian agencies, in turn, were forced to innovate just as rapidly, developing new radar systems to detect the low-profile vessels, deploying advanced signals intelligence platforms to crack the encrypted communications, and using satellite imagery to locate the hidden jungle laboratories and shipyards. The hunt for Montoya itself was a technological endeavor, relying on phone triangulation, surveillance drones, and the analysis of vast datasets to pinpoint his possible locations. This technological arms race illustrates a fundamental truth about the modern war on drugs. It is not just a physical conflict fought with guns and bullets, but a cerebral battle fought in the realms of engineering, computer science, and signals intelligence. The Norte del Valle Cartel, under Montoya's strategic direction, was a pioneer in this new era of high-tech crime, proving that criminal organizations could operate with the efficiency and innovation of a multinational tech firm, a terrifying legacy that has been inherited and expanded upon by the criminal syndicates that have followed in its footsteps, ensuring that the battle against them will forever be fought on the ever-shifting frontiers of technology, beyond the immediate shockwaves of violence and corruption. The long-term geopolitical consequences of Diego Montoya's empire have reshaped the relationships between nations and redefined international strategies for combating transnational crime, creating a legacy that extends far beyond the cocaine itself and into the very halls of global power. The sheer scale and reach of the Norte del Valle Cartel forced a fundamental recalibration of foreign policy, particularly for the United States, which found its national security interests directly threatened by the destabilization of a key regional ally. This threat was not merely theoretical. It was quantified in the billions of dollars of cocaine flooding American cities, the violence spilling over borders, and the corrosive power of cartel money infiltrating financial systems. The American response, crystallized in the multi-billion-dollar aid package known as Plan Colombia, was a landmark moment in international relations, representing a massive, long-term commitment to a partner nation's internal security struggle. This program, while controversial for its initial heavy military focus and associated human rights concerns, fundamentally altered the balance of power in Colombia, providing the hardware, training, and intelligence capabilities that eventually enabled the state to confront behemoths like Montoya's cartel on a more equal footing. Plan Colombia became a template for future American security assistance programs around the world, a model of sustained interagency cooperation aimed at building the capacity of partner nations to fight their own battles with external support. The success of this cooperation in hunting Montoya also cemented the tool of extradition as a cornerstone of international law enforcement, sending an unequivocal message to kingpins everywhere that their home turf was no longer a safe haven. This deepened integration between Colombian and American agencies, from the DEA and CIA to the FBI and the Department of Justice, created channels of communication and trust that have endured, facilitating a level of intelligence sharing that was unimaginable during the era of Pablo Escobar. Furthermore, Montoya's empire exposed critical vulnerabilities in the global financial system, leading to a concerted international effort to strengthen anti-money laundering laws and enhance the tracking of illicit financial flows across borders. Organizations like the Financial Action Task Force gained prominence, pushing for global standards that would make it harder for cartels to hide their fortunes. The relentless pursuit of Montoya's assets demonstrated a new willingness to follow the money trail across jurisdictions, forcing international banks to tighten their compliance measures and creating a more hostile environment for laundering drug proceeds. On a regional level, the cartel's operations intensified tensions and cooperation throughout Latin America. Its use of routes through Central America and the Caribbean turned those regions into bloody transit zones, fueling corruption and violence from Mexico to Haiti and forcing those nations to become frontline states in a war that was not of their making. The cartel's influence also strained Colombia's relations with its neighbors, particularly Venezuela and Ecuador, where Montoya's operatives established routes and safe houses, leading to diplomatic incidents and accusations of state complicity that frayed regional trust for years. The phenomenon of the cartel also contributed to a broader global narrative about the failed state, and the threats posed by non-state actors wielding more power than governments, a concept that would come to dominate security discussions in the 21st century in the context of terrorism, but which was first illustrated in its modern form by the drug cartels of Colombia. The story of Diego Montoya is, therefore, not a closed Colombian chapter, but an open book in the study of modern global security. It demonstrated how a non-state actor could challenge the sovereignty of a nation, how illicit economies could distort legitimate ones on a global scale, and how the response required a unified, international effort spanning military, intelligence, financial, and diplomatic spheres. The geopolitical landscape was permanently altered by his actions, leading to stronger, more institutionalized international partnerships against organized crime, but also revealing the immense difficulty of sealing borders, regulating global finance, and upholding the rule of law in a world where the profits of illegality are so astronomically high. The world that created Montoya no longer exists in many ways. It was the hunt for him and his kind that helped to destroy that old world, replacing it with a new, more interconnected, but still deeply fragile international order forever vigilant against the next shadow empire waiting to emerge from the darkness. The cultural impact of Diego Montoya's reign, the way his life and crimes seeped into the art, music, and collective consciousness of Colombia and beyond, forms a complex and troubling layer of his legacy, one where the brutal facts of his actions are often blurred and romanticized into a seductive but dangerous mythology. In the genre of narco-corridos, ballads that tell the stories of drug traffickers, figures like Montoya are often transformed into folk heroes, modern-day Robin Hoods who defied the state and achieved immense wealth, their violence sanitized and their moral emptiness ignored in favor of a narrative of ambition and power. These songs, immensely popular in certain circles, perpetuate a culture that glorifies the very lifestyle that caused so much suffering, providing a soundscape to the cycle of violence by inspiring a new generation of young men to see the cartel path as one of glory and respect. This phenomenon is not confined to music. It extends to television and film, where the rise and fall of drug lords has become a prolific genre, with series and movies often focusing on the dramatic, opulent aspects of their lives while glossing over the thousands of anonymous victims whose lives were destroyed in the process. This creates a dangerous dissonance, where the reality of mass graves and terrified communities is replaced in the popular imagination with a glamorous, high-stakes drama. Alongside this, the aesthetic of narco culture emerged, a style defined by gaudy displays of wealth, a preference for exotic animals, a love of customized, flashy vehicles, and a particular fashion sense that became synonymous with the new criminal aristocracy. This cultural output, while often condemned by the mainstream, reflects a deeper, more troubling social reality in regions plagued by poverty and state neglect. The drug lord becomes a potent symbol of a different kind of success, one achieved outside the system that has failed so many. Montoya, the quiet, calculating boss, may not have sought the flamboyant public profile of a Pablo Escobar. But his empire and his wealth made him an icon within this underworld culture, a symbol of what was possible through ruthless ambition. Yet, in stark opposition to this romanticized narrative, there exists a powerful and growing cultural movement of resistance and memory, led by artists, writers, and journalists determined to ensure that the true cost is never forgotten. Journalists like those at Colombia's leading newspapers, who investigated the cartel at great personal risk, have written definitive accounts that serve as historical records and moral correctives to the glamorized myths. Filmmakers have created sobering documentaries that focus not on the kingpins, but on the victims, the displaced, and the brave individuals who stood up to the terror. Public art installations, often featuring thousands of empty shoes to represent the disappeared, or murals painted in communities once terrorized by the cartels, serve as silent, powerful testimonials to the human toll. Literary works, from novels to books of poetry, have grappled with the psychological and social trauma of this period, attempting to process the national grief and anger through the written word. This cultural dichotomy, the glorification versus the memorialization, represents a fierce battle for Colombia's soul, a struggle over how this dark chapter will be remembered by future generations. Will it be seen as a time of daring outlaws and epic fortunes, or as a period of national tragedy and profound moral failure? The answer to this question is critical, for it will shape the country's social and political trajectory for decades to come. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez is therefore not just a criminal history, it is a cultural touchstone, a Rorschach test upon which different segments of society project their own values, their own frustrations, and their own understanding of power, justice, and success. His life has become a story told in many different ways, a narrative fought over by singers and filmmakers, by journalists and novelists, each version competing for the right to define the truth of an era. And in this great cultural contest, the most dangerous version of all is the one that forgets the screams and remembers only the silence, that forgets the bloodstains and remembers only the gold. For it is that version that plants the seeds for the next Diego Montoya, waiting in the wings for his turn to step into the limelight of infamy, armed with the dangerous belief that crime, if done on a grand enough scale, can be a path to immortality. As the dust settled on the shattered empire of the Norte del Valle Cartel, and its captured leader began his eternal sentence in a distant prison, the story inevitably turns to the question of what remains, to the enduring scars and the fragile hopes that define the Colombia of today, a nation forever marked by its confrontation with the darkness Montoya represented. The physical scars are perhaps the most visible, from the mass graves still being discovered in the countryside, holding the anonymous remains of the cartel's countless victims, to the abandoned laboratories and narco-submarine shipyards being slowly reclaimed by the relentless jungle. Silent monuments to a fallen industry, the human scars run even deeper, carried in the collective memory of a generation that grew up with the sounds of gunfire and the sight of impromptu roadblocks. manned by armed teenagers. A generation for whom violence was normalized and trust was a luxury they could not afford. The psychological trauma is a national inheritance, a subtle undercurrent of anxiety and suspicion that persists in the social fabric, a lingering ghost of the time when a knock on the door could mean a death sentence, and when the line between the state and the criminal was often indistinguishable. The institutional scars are evident in the ongoing struggle to root out the deep-seated corruption that the cartel so expertly implanted, a task akin to pulling up a vast, tenacious root system that has intertwined itself with the very foundations of the state. And yet, amidst this landscape of scars, there are also powerful signs of resilience and a determined march toward a different future. The successful prosecution of Montoya and the dismantling of his cartel provided a profound psychological boost, a tangible proof that the state could, indeed, win. This hard-won confidence has fueled a remarkable transformation in cities like Medellin and Cali, which have been reinvented as hubs of innovation, culture, and tourism. Their violent pasts now a subject of historical tours rather than daily reality. The Colombian National Police and military, forged in the brutal crucible of the drug war, have emerged as a highly professional and respected force. Their expertise now sought after by other nations facing similar threats. The space once dominated by monolithic cartels is now contested by a more fragmented criminal landscape. But the state's capacity to confront these groups is immeasurably greater than it was during Montoya's peak. Civil society has also grown stronger, with a vibrant press, active human rights organizations, and a citizenry that is far less willing to accept the old narratives of violence and impunity. The current generation of young Colombians, while fully aware of their country's painful history, is increasingly looking outward, engaging with the world through technology, education, and a desire for peace that stands in stark contrast to the ambitions of the narcos, who once held their nation hostage. This is not to say the challenges are over. The production of coca continues, new criminal bands adapt and evolve, and the social inequities that provide fertile ground for recruitment remain a stubborn problem. But the context has fundamentally changed. The myth of the invincible kingpin has been broken. The idea that a single man can build a private empire that challenges the sovereignty of the state has been proven, in the long run, to be a fatal illusion. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez, when viewed from this broader perspective, becomes the story of a terrible fever that broke a nation, a near-fatal illness that forced a painful reckoning, and ultimately triggered a powerful immune response. His legacy is therefore a paradox. He is both a symbol of Colombia's darkest hour and an unwitting catalyst for its renewal. The nation that exists today is, in part, a nation forged in opposition to everything he represented. His life stands as a permanent monument to a path of destruction, while his downfall marks the moment Colombia began to consciously, and with great effort, choose a different road, a road that leads away from the shadows of the past and toward the uncertain, but hopeful, light of a future built not on fear and cocaine, but on law, memory, and the unwavering pursuit of peace. To fully appreciate the finality of Diego Montoya's downfall, one must journey into the stark, unforgiving reality of his present existence. A world deliberately designed to be the absolute antithesis of the power, luxury, and influence he once commanded. He is inmate number, a anonymous cog in the vast, dehumanizing machinery of the United States Federal Bureau of Prisons, housed in a supermax facility, the most secure level of incarceration the country has to offer. These institutions are not merely prisons, they are human warehouses, technological tombs, where the most dangerous inmates are kept in conditions of near total isolation and control, their every movement monitored by cameras and sensors, their interactions with other human beings severely limited or conducted through barriers of reinforced steel and shatterproof glass. His world is now measured in concrete and steel, a small, sterile cell where he spends up to 23 hours a day, with 1 hour of solitary recreation in a slightly larger, outdoor cage, a glimpse of a sky he can no longer touch. This is a life of profound sensory deprivation, a stark contrast to the vibrant, chaotic, and sensory, rich world of the Colombian countryside he once ruled. The sounds of his day are not the rustle of jungle leaves or the whispered reports of his lieutenants, but the constant, low hum of machinery, the electronic buzz of locks, the distant, echoing clang of metal doors, and the occasional shouted communication from a guard. The opulent meals prepared by private chefs are a distant memory, replaced by pre-packaged, nutritionally calculated meals passed through a slot in his cell door. The absolute authority he wielded, the power to command life and death with a nod, has been inverted into a state of complete powerlessness, where his daily routine is dictated by a strict, unchangeable schedule set by his jailers, where he must ask permission for the most basic of human needs. This is the ultimate punishment for a man like Montoya, a man whose entire identity was built upon control. He has been stripped of all of it, rendered passive and dependent on the very system he spent his life defying. There is no empire to manage, no shipments to coordinate, no rivals to eliminate, only the endless, monotonous stretch of time, day after identical day, stretching out before him until his death. The 45-year sentence ensures he will never again breathe the air of freedom, never again see his homeland, never again hold his family. He is a living ghost, a man who exists only in the memories of those he wronged and in the case files of the agencies that hunted him. Any wealth he managed to hide has likely been seized or is forever beyond his reach, useless to him in this concrete womb. The fear he once instilled in millions has been replaced by his own, more intimate fears of illness, of violence from other inmates, of dying alone in this sterile environment. This existence is a form of psychological death, a slow erasure of the self, far more profound than an execution would have been. For the victims of his cartel, for the families of the thousands he murdered, this living death may be the only form of justice that feels proportionate to his crimes. It is a quiet, undramatic, and perpetual punishment, a life sentence not just of confinement, but of profound irrelevance. The world has moved on, new cartels have risen, new conflicts simmer, and the name Diego Montoya Sánchez, once whispered with terror, is now a historical footnote. A name studied in criminology classes and mentioned in documentaries about a bygone era of narcoterrorism. His current reality is the final, brutal demystification of the myth of the boss. There is no glory here, no romance, no power, only the cold, hard, boring reality of a man being stored away by society, a dangerous specimen rendered harmless, his roar reduced to a silence that will one day be permanent. This is the true end of his story, not the dramatic capture in the crawl space, but the decades of silence that followed, a long, slow fade to black that serves as the ultimate cautionary tale for anyone who dares to dream of building an empire on a foundation of blood and cocaine. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez, when stripped of its sensational details and viewed through the cold lens of historical analysis, ultimately transcends the man himself and becomes a profound and universal lesson on the inherent fragility and self-consuming nature of absolute power built upon a foundation of illegality and terror. His entire life's work stands as a monumental case study in the inevitable failure of the criminal enterprise, no matter how brilliantly conceived or ruthlessly executed. The very strategies that enabled his meteoric rise contained the seeds of his own destruction, a built-in obsolescence that guaranteed the empire would eventually crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The reliance on extreme violence, while effective in the short term for enforcing discipline and eliminating rivals, created an ecosystem of perpetual fear and betrayal that made lasting loyalty impossible and inevitably led to the internal schism with his cousin that fatally weakened the cartel from within. The immense financial wealth, while granting him temporary power and influence, also made him a colossal target, attracting the relentless attention of international law enforcement agencies whose resources and persistence ultimately outstripped his ability to hide and evade. The systemic corruption that greased the wheels of his organization also created a dependency on a vast network of compromised individuals, each one a potential point of failure, a leak that could bring the entire structure down, a lesson brutally learned as former politicians, soldiers, and even his closest associates began to provide evidence against him in exchange for leniency. The business model itself, predicated on supplying an illegal substance to a voracious foreign market, placed him in a permanent state of war not only with the governments of the United States and Colombia, but also with rival organizations, a multi-front conflict that no single entity, no matter how powerful, could sustain indefinitely. The paranoia that was a necessary survival skill in his world eventually became a pathological condition that isolated him, distorted his judgment, and made him incapable of the strategic alliances and long-term planning required for enduring power. His story perfectly illustrates the ancient Greek concept of hubris, the fatal arrogance that leads to a downfall. For in his belief that he was untouchable, he failed to see the myriad ways in which his power was an illusion, dependent on a precarious balance of forces that was destined to collapse. He was, in the end, a temporary phenomenon, a violent disruption in the social order, not a permanent new reality. His empire was a parasite, and like all parasites, it could only thrive as long as its host. The legitimate economy, the political system, the social fabric remained functional enough to support it. By attacking and weakening these very institutions through corruption and violence, he was inadvertently destroying the foundation of his own power. The state, once weakened and humiliated, eventually rallied, learning from its past failures, adapting its tactics, and marshaling its resources with a focus and determination that his decentralized, profit-driven organization could not ultimately match. The story of Diego Montoya is therefore not the story of a brilliant criminal mastermind who was eventually caught. It is the story of a man who was, from the very beginning, building on quicksand, whose every success made his ultimate failure more certain. His life proves that in the long arc of history, the centralized, hierarchical, terror-based criminal empire is an unsustainable model, too brittle, too visible, and too destructive to survive the concerted opposition of legitimate societal forces. His legacy, beyond the pain and suffering, is a textbook demonstration of the limits of criminal power, a reminder that the pursuit of power through fear and corruption is a self-defeating prophecy, a path that leads inevitably to a small, lonely cell, where the only thing left to rule is the memory of a fallen kingdom, and the only thing left to command is the silence that now fills the void where an empire used to be. As we approach the final summation of this dark saga, it is crucial to pull our gaze back from the individual and examine the vast, interconnected web of complicity and resistance that defined the era of Diego Montoya, for his story is not his alone, but is inextricably woven into the lives of millions whose fates were altered by his actions. A tapestry of human experience ranging from the depths of depravity to the heights of courage. Consider the anonymous farmer in the Peruvian highlands, his small plot of land, his only inheritance, who turns to coca not out of greed, but out of desperation, because it is the only crop that guarantees a buyer and provides for his family, making him an unwitting and unpaid foot soldier in Montoya's global supply chain. Consider the young man in the slums of Cali, with no prospects for education or legitimate employment, who is offered a life of purpose and power as a sicario, his humanity systematically erased and replaced with a fanatical loyalty to a man he may never even meet, his life destined to be short, brutal, and ending in a ditch or a prison cell. Consider the mid-level banker in Miami who, under pressure to meet ambitious targets, chooses to look the other way at the inexplicably large cash deposits from a series of shell companies, rationalizing his complicity as simply doing his job, thus becoming a critical node in the international money laundering apparatus. Consider the honest police officer in Colombia, paid a pittance, who refuses the cartel's offer of plata o plomo and is subsequently murdered in front of his family, his death serving as a chilling message to his colleagues. Contrast his fate with that of the corrupt general who, for a steady stream of cash, provides the cartel with inside information on military movements, actively sabotaging the state's efforts to capture its most wanted enemy. Then there are the voices of resistance, often quieter, but no less powerful, the journalist who publishes an exposé on cartel influence in local politics, knowing it may cost her her life. The judge who signs an extradition order despite the death threats left on her doorstep. The grassroots community leader who organizes his neighbors to reject the cartel's presence, reclaiming their streets block by block. The American DEA agent who spends years away from his own family, painstakingly building a case from thousands of disparate fragments of intelligence, driven by a belief in justice that transcends borders. This vast human network, this constellation of choices made under unimaginable pressure, is the true landscape upon which the war for Colombia's soul was fought. For every kilo of cocaine Montoya shipped, there was a customs agent who either waved it through or risked his life to stop it. For every $1 million he laundered, there was a financial investigator diligently following the digital trail. For every murder he ordered, there was a family left to grieve and, in some cases, to demand justice. Diego Montoya Sánchez did not exist in a vacuum. He was the vortex at the center of a human hurricane, a force that pulled in countless lives, twisting some towards evil, inspiring others towards incredible bravery, and devastating many more who were simply caught in the storm. His story, therefore, cannot be understood merely as the biography of a criminal kingpin, but must be seen as a sweeping human drama that encapsulates the eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos, between greed and integrity, between fear and courage. He was the catalyst, but the reactions he provoked revealed the character of a nation and the individuals within it. To focus solely on him is to miss the larger, more important story of the human spirit's capacity for both terrible wickedness and breathtaking resilience in the face of it. The true history of the Norte del Valle Cartel is written not in its account ledgers, but in the collective memory of all these people, the coerced, the complicit, the corrupted, the courageous, and the crushed, whose intertwined lives form the complete and complex truth of a time when one man's ambition cast a long shadow over an entire generation, a shadow from which Colombia is still and will forever be emerging. And so we arrive at the end of our long journey, a journey that began with the terrifying specter of an all-powerful criminal emperor and concludes with the stark image of a forgotten old man in a prison cell. A journey that has taken us through the heart of darkness and back again, and it is here that we must gather the threads of this complex tapestry and offer a final reflection on what the story of Diego León Montoya Sánchez truly means for us. The audience, living in a world still grappling with the consequences of the choices made by men like him. The purpose of recounting this history in such detail, of revisiting the pain and the violence, was never to sensationalize or to glorify, but to understand, to truly comprehend the scale of the devastation that occurs when ambition is completely untethered from morality, when power is pursued not for the betterment of society, but for its absolute subjugation. The rise and fall of the boss is the ultimate cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the pursuit of power through fear and corruption is a self-defeating prophecy, a path that leads inevitably to isolation, paranoia, and a profound, lasting irrelevance. His life stands as a permanent testament to the fact that no criminal empire, no matter how vast its resources or how brutal its methods, can ultimately withstand the collective will of a society that decides it has had enough, that rallies its institutions, its brave individuals, and its international allies to reclaim its future. This story is also a solemn homage to the countless unsung heroes, the journalists, the judges, the police officers, the soldiers, and the ordinary citizens who stood up to the terror, often at the cost of their own lives, to ensure that light would eventually pierce the darkness. They are the true protagonists of this story, the ones who proved that courage is more powerful than fear, and that integrity is more enduring than corruption. It challenges us to think about the economic disparities and lack of opportunity that create a ready pool of recruits for cartels in source countries. It asks us to scrutinize the financial systems that allow billions in dirty money to be laundered and integrated into the legitimate global economy. The story of Diego Montoya is not a closed chapter from a distant land. It is a mirror held up to our interconnected world, reflecting our shared responsibilities and our shared vulnerabilities. His downfall was a vital victory for justice, but it was not a permanent solution. We must not be passive consumers of this history. We must be active participants in shaping a future where such empires cannot rise again. This requires vigilance. It requires demanding accountability from our leaders and financial institutions. It requires supporting policies that address the root causes of drug production and consumption. And it requires a global commitment to justice that transcends borders. The story of Diego Montoya Sánchez is over. But the story of our response to the world that created him is still being written. It is a story that we all have a hand in authoring. We must choose to learn from the past, to honor the sacrifices of the victims and the heroes, and to work towards a world where such immense, concentrated criminal power becomes an impossibility. The journey through the life of the boss has been long and dark, but it is our hope that, by understanding this darkness completely, we can all play a part in ensuring that the light, however faint it may sometimes seem, will never be extinguished. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness, and for taking this important journey into the heart of one of history's most formidable criminal empires. The responsibility to remember and to act now passes to you.